Hello and welcome everybody to another edition of the Saturdays are for the Byzantines podcast. My name is Professor Wren and I am your host. Today I wanted to bring you a quick little lecture here just to address something a group of people that we're obviously going to be spending a good deal of time talking about in the coming episodes, and that is the Ottoman Turks, the Ottoman Empire, which is rising here. As you know, it has been a bit since we've had our last lecture. I do hope you enjoyed our little discussion there on education that I posted with a couple of friends of mine met in the last month or so. Had an interesting conversation there about the state of education in the United States from a bit more of a traditional perspective. If you haven't seen it yet on the YouTube channel, it was a collaboration there with these guys. Their name is the American Redemption Podcast. You can check them out on Apple Podcast and Spotify, and they just recently made a YouTube channel, so you can check them out. All the places where you can find my podcast, you can find the American Redemption Podcast as well. Theirs is more of a cultural type of podcast, not really a history podcast, but it's still definitely worth checking out. I'd recommend subscribing to them, and I'd also recommend subscribing to this channel. So if you've not done so already, please make sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, like this video, leave a comment if you have any questions. It's the best way to interact with me and to get my opinions on things that maybe I don't bring up in the videos is to ask a question in the YouTube comment section. Or you can leave a hater comment in the YouTube comment section, and that still helps us with the algorithm. I'll take either one. But anyway, on to the Turks. So, obviously, as we know, I don't think I'm spoiling anything. This is more than a couple hundred years of history, but the Ottoman Turks are the ones who bring down the Byzantine Empire. And so I think it's important for us to remember. Sorry, there's noises going on in the background of the apartment. It's important for us to know the background of the Ottoman Turks before we move forward here, so we know exactly who we're dealing with, because the Ottomans are, for a while, the largest empire in the world for a couple hundred years there. Quite the power player. So, the Ottomans originate from a tribal people in northwestern Anatolia. They come from the old Sultanate of Rum, which was they come from the Seljuk tribe, but they're a subgroup of the Seljuk tribe. So they're not just purely Seljuks, but they are a subgroup of the Seljuks. So that's important. They are a tribal people. They're not necessarily settled and really advanced in terms of civilization at the start, but obviously they're going to become very advanced in their civilization as time goes on. The Ottomans are Sunni Muslims, so they are of the Islamic faith, the Sunni variety, as opposed to the Shia variety. And I remember one Islamic historian. I can't remember his name. He was a British Islamic historian. I was reading one of his books once for an Islam class that I took in college, and he said the biggest difference between Sunnis and Shias is that Sunnis are not Shias, and that was that was his main distinction there. Obviously, there's more. It's more complex than that, but there are a lot of similarities between Sunnis and Shias, but obviously also still plenty of differences, and they would not, I'm sure many of them would not appreciate being so closely compared. But either way, for the Ottomans, much of their early military success, and they did have a lot of success militarily early on. They're pushing back the Byzantine Empire, and Western Europe is going to send several waves of various crusades at them. They defeat the Serbians, they defeat the Bulgarians, they can defeat a combined crusader force of Hungarians and Poles. So they're really they're beating back everything that comes at them. And so for the early Ottomans, a lot of their success was often attributed to their religious fervor, and kind of a theodicy idea here, that theodicy meaning that you have success because God favors you, or you're doing something that's pleasing to God, so therefore he grants you success, right? Most of the early adherents to the Ottomans were Turkish tribesmen, but there were also some disaffected Byzantines who joined up with the ranks of the Ottoman Turks, some guys who maybe had been boxed out of what was left of the Byzantine Empire, weren't really pleased with what was going on there at the time, which kind of hard to blame them given the state that the Byzantines find themselves at the time period we're talking about here, which is kind of we're kind of in the mid to late 1200s at this point in time. Most of the lectures upcoming will be in the 1300s and 1400s. But the Byzantines who did join the Ottomans end up converting to Islam. Okay. Now, the Ottomans quickly expanded into Europe. They took Byzantine Thrace and Thessalonica and Greece, etc. Early opposition to the Ottomans actually comes from the Balkans, not so much from the Byzantines. The Byzantines are really just holding on to Constantinople and relying on those triple Theodosian walls to save them. But apart from that, there's not a whole lot going on with the Byzantines at this point in time. Most of the opposition to the Ottomans is going to come from new growing Orthodox Christian kingdoms in the Balkans, such as the Serbians, the Bulgarians, the Albanians provide some resistance for a while, the Croats as well, and then also Eastern European Catholic crusaders, like I said, the Hungarians and the Poles. Some people will consider Poland Central Europe. I don't know, especially the more traditional pre-World War II borders of Poland are more. It's more Eastern Europe, I think. Feel free to disagree in the comments. Now, in quick succession, the Ottomans beat back most of their their opposition from Eastern Christian kingdoms, like I said, Serbia, Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria. The most serious opposition to the Ottomans and their only defeat in this early period actually comes from the Timurids from the east, another Muslim state. The Timurids were kind of an offshoot of the Mongols. Their leader Timur the Lame, who we will have a full, more of a full lecture looking into the Timurids and the rise and the reign of Timur the Lame, or as some people in the West would call him Tamerlane. He claimed he claimed that he was a descendant of Genghis Khan, which was probably not the case. But in order to try to bolster his legitimacy, Tamerlane takes a bride who is like I believe the granddaughter or some sort of descendant of Genghis Khan to try to legitimize his reign. But he comes up in the east out of, I believe, what is modern Uzbekistan is where he's from. And then he builds his empire there in Central Asia and expands into Iran and Iraq. And eventually he makes his way through the Caucasus. And then after some kind of fighting words exchange between Timur and the Ottoman Sultan, they end up. So the Timurids invade the Ottoman territory there, and at the Battle of Ankara in 402, the Timurids hand the Ottomans their first serious defeat, and also kidnap the Ottoman Sultan, who will die in Timurid captivity. And this gives the Byzantines a brief respite because the sons of, I believe it's Sultan Bayezid. I was avoiding saying it because I'm pretty sure it's Bayezid, but I don't want to say the wrong one. But either way, the sons of the Sultan ends up, having a big conflict as to who is going to, succeed their father, right? And that goes on for a while. I believe some people call this the interregnum period, and it's going to be a while before the Ottomans kind of get back on their feet, settle the internal chaos, have a firm leader to move forward in their conquest, right? I thought I would also take a little bit of time here to discuss the Ottoman military, because obviously the Ottomans have a whole lot of success here in this early period of theirs. So let's talk about some of their how their military was composed. So being an Eastern power, being basically most of the Muslim powers from the Middle Ages were heavily reliant on cavalry. They're expert horse riders. So you have akinjis, which are light cavalry, usually mounted bows. These are tribesmen. They're irregulars. They're not necessarily professional soldiers, but they are certainly deadly. Certainly, the light cavalry has a lot of uses. Certainly good at tiring out heavily armored Western cavalry. Uh, then you also have in the ranks of the Ottoman army the Sipahi cavalry, which are a heavier cavalry. They're not like Western heavy cavalry. They're not heavy lancers, but they're the Akinjis are going to be lightly armored. The Sipahis are going to be wearing some armor. Like I said, these are professional soldiers. These are not the irregular kind of tribes people that the Akinjis were. And the Sipahis are armed with a variety of weapons. They're expert marksmen, similar to the Akinjis, but then they're also armed with melee weapons like swords. I believe sometimes they would also carry clubs or axes. These were the real crack backbone of the Ottoman cavalry. These guys were their top quality cavalrymen, and then there were also the real elite Ottoman cavalry were called Capiculus, which were sort of, if I understand it correctly, and Muslim military is not my strong point, but I believe the Capiculus were similar to a cataphract. I can't remember if they were. I believe they probably would have been armed with a bow, but also were a heavier cavalry, more similar to a Western knight type of cavalry. And then you also have the Janissaries, which are the Sultan's personal troops, the Sultan's personal bodyguard. And these were made the Janissaries are made up of kidnapped Christian boys, typically from the Balkans, although sometimes also from Armenia. So a lot of Bulgarians, Serbians, Croatians, as well as Armenians were kidnapped, boys taken out of their homes forcibly, and then brought to a barracks in Ankara or wherever in the Ottoman Empire, forcibly converted to Islam, and then raised to be soldiers, loyal exclusively to the Sultan. And these were elite soldiers as well. Elite slave soldiers, which were not unlike the Mamluks, who were the Mamluks were also slave soldiers who came to power in Egypt. I believe they were Turkish. They were initially employed by the Arabs as slave soldiers, and then basically came to overthrow their masters and became the rulers down there in Egypt. It should be noted that the Ottomans were expert archers. Many stories of I haven't read them myself. I've heard people talk about them though, of stories of these great, seemingly impossible achievements with the bow that the Ottomans had. Pinning a fly against a wall from 100 yards away with a bow or something like that. And then also to add to the expertise that the Ottomans had with ranged weapons, they're also early adapters of gunpowder. Right, many people know about the Grand Bombard, which was this massive cannon that the Ottomans used to help break down the Theodosian walls. And even though the Theodosian walls had never been broken through before that, after some time of being bombarded by the Grand Bombard, the walls of Constantinople did fall. Took a lot though. Theodosius knew what he was doing. And they're also early adapters of handheld firearms as well, were the Ottomans. So they kind of have this idea, and it's a good idea of, if I can stand far away from you and I can kill you and I'm not under threat, well, that's good for me, because then we can take out a lot of the enemy without putting ourselves at risk. This is something George Washington, the first American president and commander of the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War, very heavily relied on and liked using artillery. very, Washington liked to use his artillery. And the idea with that was that he could kill the enemy without putting his own soldiers at risk. Now, part of this was pragmatic, that Washington did not have a lot of soldiers, and the ones he had were not exactly very good in many circumstances. A lot of old men and young boys. But there's also a humanitarian aspect, kind of a moral aspect to this as well, because if you don't have to put your own soldiers in harm's way, why do that? This was something the Europeans could not understand about the Americans in the Revolutionary War, and kind of going forward was, well, why not just send a mass line of infantry forward? Well, you're going to get a lot of those guys killed, and so if you can accomplish the goal by using artillery and not risk the lives of your own soldiers, then why not do it? One last thing that I thought was kind of interesting here, and I want to bring up: the Ottomans also had several legal systems, several court systems. So one court system that the Ottomans had was governed by Sharia law, which is the Islamic law used to govern Muslim citizens in the empire, which would have been the predominant and the highest ranking, the most recognized court system within the Ottoman Empire. There was a second legal system, kind of a second tier legal system for non-Muslims, obviously, because again, if you know your history, right, Christians and Jews would have been viewed as second-class citizens in Islamic countries, and in many Islamic countries today is still the case. And so they had a separate court system where Christians and Jews would be appointed to run that court system and govern themselves. Although there were oftentimes, or sorry, no, mistake there. Muslim appointees would oversee the legal system that was, or the courts that were for Christians and Jews. Although interestingly, oftentimes Christians and Jews would seek a ruling from the Sharia court in the empire in order to get a more authoritative ruling, because sometimes the ruling that came from obviously like a second class court is maybe not going to be viewed as seriously as if you got a ruling from the most respected court within the empire, right? And then there was a third legal system, a third court system that the Ottomans, who were Muslim, had to govern trade and merchant endeavors within the empire as well. So they have a third court system there for any sort of trade business that went on. And one last thing, the Ottomans did also rely a good deal on localism and local authorities to settle disputes, because obviously the Ottoman Empire was a massive empire, and it's very difficult for the Sultan operating there, whether it was in Ankara or Constantinople, to be able to handle administering a massive empire like that. And so intelligently, the Ottomans left a lot of matters to be settled by local authorities, because when you're hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles away, it's going to be very difficult, especially with no instant communication. Sometimes I think it's easy for us to forget that there was no instant communication back then. Helps things run a lot smoother. So that's all I have for you guys today. Again, this is just a cursory glance at the rise of the Ottoman Empire. There's certainly a lot more that could be said about it, but I just kind of want to give a little introduction to this new group of people that are going to be a serious part of our story moving forward. So if you've made it this far in the video, thank you very much. Make sure to hit the like button. Make sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss another episode. You can also follow us on Apple Podcast and Spotify. And if you're listening on Apple Podcast, please make sure to give us a 5-star review as well. That's all for today, and I'll see y'all next time.